Elizabeth stepped off the train onto the dusty station platform with hope fluttering in her heart. The year was 1878, and the bustling little frontier town was her destination after a long journey westward. She smoothed her simple calico dress, one of the few nice belongings she owned, and clutched a small travel trunk that contained all her worldly possessions. In her pocket she kept a carefully folded letter, the promise of a new life. The letter was from a man named Henry who had courted her through pen and paper, a man she was supposed to marry upon arrival. As a mail-order bride, Elizabeth had left behind a life of hardship back east, dreaming of a fresh start. The endless blue sky and golden plains around her seemed to mirror the cautious optimism she felt. With a deep breath, she walked forward, scanning the gathered crowd for the face of the man whose kind words had brought her here. At last, Elizabeth spotted a gentleman who fit Henry's description, a tall man in a neatly pressed suit and a vest embroidered with subtle patterns. His moustache was trimmed, and his boots were polished free of dust, a sign that he was more prosperous than many of the rough-clad cowhands around. She mustered a bright smile and approached him. "Henry?" she asked softly. The man turned, eyeing her up and down. "Elizabeth," he replied, but there was a note of surprise or disappointment in his voice. Elizabeth's smile faltered slightly. This was the moment she had dreamed of, yet something in Henry's expression set her nerves on edge. Henry cleared his throat. I wasn't expecting you to look so..." He trailed off. Elizabeth's heart sank. The hopeful light in her eyes dimmed as she looked at him in confusion. "Is something the matter?" she ventured, trying to keep her voice steady. Henry frowned and gestured at her simple attire and the scuffed trunk by her feet. "You didn't mention in your letters that you were coming with nothing. I expected..." He paused, searching for polite words that would not come. "I expected a wife who could at least bring a decent dowry or proper furnishings to a household. I have my reputation to think of." His tone turned cold and matter-of-fact. Elizabeth felt as if she'd been struck. She flushed with shame, instinctively brushing a stray lock of dark hair back under her modest bonnet. All she had were a few clothes, a well-worn Bible, and a patchwork quilt made by her late mother. In her letters, she had been honest about her humble origins, or so she thought. But now Henry's eyes swept over her meager belongings with clear disapproval. "I'm sorry if I misled you," Elizabeth said in a small voice, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I have little in the way of wealth. I came here ready to work hard and make a home with you. I thought, your letters made me believe you cared for me as I am." Henry's jaw tightened. People on the platform were beginning to glance over, sensing the tension. He stepped closer and spoke in a hushed, curt whisper. "I need a wife who can help elevate my standing, not someone who will be a burden. I've worked too hard to build my ranch and my name in this town. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, but this arrangement isn't going to work." He pulled a small coin purse from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "Here, this should cover a return ticket east or whatever you may need." Elizabeth stared at the money through a blur of tears. She did not want his money. She wanted the life they had promised each other. "Please, I don't need much," she pleaded softly, voice trembling. "Just a chance. I would be a good wife to you." Her plea hung in the air. Henry avoided her gaze, shaking his head. With that, he tipped his hat to her stiffly and turned on his heel, leaving Elizabeth standing alone. The cheerful chatter of other arriving passengers and their joyous reunions felt cruel by contrast. Elizabeth's vision swam as she watched Henry walk away, his figure growing distant through her tears until he disappeared into the dusty streets of town without a backward glance. For a long moment, Elizabeth stood frozen on the train platform, her heart in pieces. The world around her moved on. Porters unloaded luggage, families embraced, stagecoach drivers called out to new passengers. No one else knew that Elizabeth's hopes had been shattered in an instant. She felt utterly alone and adrift. Finally, the station master politely asked her to step aside so others could pass. Clutching her travel trunk, Elizabeth moved to a wooden bench at the edge of the platform and sank down, numbness overtaking the initial sting of rejection. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, Elizabeth wondered what to do next. She had scant money, Henry's unwanted purse of coins, and a few dollars of her own tucked away. The thought of buying a return ticket back east crossed her mind. But back to what? The orphanage where she'd been raised until she was 16? The threadbare boarding house where she'd worked as a seamstress to scrape by? There was nothing, and no one to return to. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she hurriedly wiped it away, not wanting to break down in public. She straightened her back, trying to gather herself even as despair threatened to crush her. This frontier town was supposed to be her new home. Now it was just a strange place full of strangers, and she had nowhere to go. "Excuse me, miss. Are you all right?" came a gentle voice from nearby. Elizabeth looked up quickly, startled out of her dark reverie. Standing a few paces away was a man carrying a sack of feed over one broad shoulder. He had rugged, kind features, a strong jaw lightly dusted with stubble, sun-browned skin, and concerned hazel eyes that caught the light. He was dressed in the work clothes of a rancher, well-worn denim trousers, sturdy boots, and a brimmed hat pushed back on his head, revealing hair the colour of sand. He set down the heavy sack as he spoke, as if to make himself less imposing. Elizabeth hurriedly brushed at her eyes and managed a faint, polite smile. I'm fine, thank you, she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. I couldn't help but notice what happened, he said softly. Elizabeth's cheeks burned with embarrassment at the thought of anyone witnessing her humiliation. She opened her mouth to dismiss it, but the man went on, his tone gentle and earnest. I'm sorry. No one deserves to be treated that way. Something in his voice, perhaps the genuine sympathy, broke through Elizabeth's resolve to stay composed. A quiet sob escaped her before she could stop it. Immediately she pressed a hand to her mouth, mortified by her own outburst. The man didn't recoil or rush away from her tears as some might. Instead, he slowly sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. He removed his hat, holding it loosely in work-roughened hands. My name's Jacob, he introduced himself kindly. Jacob Hale. I run a ranch a few miles outside town. Do you need any help, miss? Elizabeth looked into Jacob's warm eyes, finding a sincerity there that made her feel safe in spite of her vulnerability. I'm Elizabeth, she replied after a moment, her voice trembling. Elizabeth Garcia. Saying her own name aloud steadied her a little. She swallowed hard and continued, not sure why she found herself confiding in this stranger. I was supposed to be married today. I came all this way as a mail-order bride, but the groom changed his mind when he saw me. She cast her eyes down at her lap, unable to meet Jacob's gaze as she admitted it. Jacob's brows drew together in concern. I'm truly sorry, he murmured. He hesitated, then asked, Do you have a place to stay? Any family here in the West? Elizabeth shook her head. She explained quietly that she was alone, with nowhere to go now that her planned marriage had fallen through. As she spoke, Jacob's expression shifted from concern to resolve. Without hesitation, he said, I know we just met, but I can't in good conscience leave you like this. There's a decent boarding house down the road. I can take you there, or if you'd prefer, my ranch has plenty of room. It might be more comfortable than a crowded boarding house, and safer too. I have an extra room. It was my sister's when she would visit. You're welcome to it for as long as you need until you figure out what to do next. Elizabeth was taken aback by the kindness of Jacob's offer. In a single afternoon she had seen the worst and best of human nature, the cruelty of rejection and the compassion of a stranger. She hesitated, thinking of propriety. To go with an unfamiliar man to his ranch might raise eyebrows, but then, remaining in town as a stranded single woman had its own perils. The boarding house cost money she scarcely had, and likely was full of rowdy gold prospectors or drifters. Jacob's open, honest face and the gentle way he waited for her answer gave her a sense that he truly meant her no harm. In fact, there was something slightly forlorn in his own eyes, as if he understood loneliness and loss himself. I don't want to impose, Elizabeth said softly. Her voice was still unsteady, but Jacob shook his head. It's no imposition. The ranch is quiet these days, and frankly, I could use the company of someone to talk to besides my foreman and the cattle, he added with a small, disarming smile. At least let me take you there for tonight. You can decide later what you want to do next. We can figure something out in the morning when you're feeling better. After a moment more of indecision, Elizabeth gave a tiny nod. All right, thank you, she murmured. Gratitude flooded her words. You're very kind, Mr. Hale. Jacob stood and gently took the trunk from her hand. Just Jacob, please, he said. Let's get you out of this sun. Elizabeth followed Jacob through the dusty main street to where his horse and wagon were hitched. As they walked, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows from the false-fronted buildings. Elizabeth noticed a few townsfolk glancing their way, some with curiosity, others with knowing smiles at Jacob's protective stance beside her. A blush warmed her cheeks, but she kept her chin up. She had done nothing to be ashamed of. Accepting a stranger's kindness was better than being utterly alone. Jacob helped her onto the wagon seat and then stowed her trunk in the back. Soon they were rumbling out of town along a rutted dirt road. The prairie unfurled before them, wide and endless. Elizabeth sat quietly, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as the wagon wheels creaked and the horse's hooves kicked up little clouds of dust. She stole a few glances at Jacob. In profile, he looked solemn and focused on the road, but there was a gentleness about him that put her at ease. After a stretch of silence, Jacob spoke without taking his eyes off the horizon. I hope you won't think me too forward for saying so, but that man, Henry, he's a fool. Elizabeth looked down at her hands, fiddling with a frayed thread on her sleeve. It all happened so fast, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. I suppose I should have known such luck was too good to be true. A tear she'd been holding back slid down her cheek. Jacob slowed the wagon and drew the reins to stop the horses. The sudden halt jostled Elizabeth slightly, and she glanced over at him in surprise. Jacob's hazel eyes were full of earnest intensity. "Miss Elizabeth, listen," he said gently. "Don't ever think this was your fault, or that you're not good enough. I don't know Henry well, but no decent man would do what he did today. His heart must be smaller than a mustard seed if he can't see your worth." His words were firm, almost angry on her behalf, and Elizabeth felt them sink into her soul. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed such validation until that moment. "Thank you," she whispered, offering a tremulous smile through her tears. Jacob gave a single nod, then clicked his tongue and set the wagon in motion again. As the horses moved, the wagon crested a gentle rise. He pointed to a spread of land in the distance, neat fence lines, a herd of grazing cattle like dark dots on the grass, and a cluster of buildings with a wisp of smoke curling from a chimney. "That's my place," he said. "Sagebrush Hills Ranch." The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. In that light, the ranch looked peaceful and welcoming. Elizabeth found herself exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Perhaps, she thought, fate had brought her here for a reason. They arrived at the ranch just as dusk settled. Jacob pulled up in front of a modest ranch house built of sturdy timber. He helped Elizabeth down from the wagon. She could see a large barn nearby and endless fields beyond. The air smelled of prairie grass and horseflesh, a clean, earthy scent that was foreign but not unpleasant to her. A middle-aged man with a greying beard emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Evening, boss," the man called, eyeing Elizabeth curiously. Jacob offered a wave. "Evening, Roy. This is Miss Elizabeth Garcia. She'll be staying with us for a little while. Could you see that the horse gets unhitched and fed?" Roy nodded amiably. "Sure thing, ma'am," he added with a polite tip of his hat to Elizabeth before taking the horse's reins and leading the animal toward the barn. Jacob carried Elizabeth's trunk up the steps and into the house. Inside, the home was cozy, but showed signs of being a place of hard work and solitude. The main room had a large stone hearth with ashes from an old fire, a worn but comfortable-looking leather sofa, and shelves lined with a few books and practical items. A rifle rested on a rack above the mantel, and a braided rug lay on the plank floor. Elizabeth also noticed small, homely touches, a vase holding a handful of dried wildflowers, a rocking chair in the corner draped with a knitted shawl. These hints of a feminine presence made Elizabeth wonder if there had once been a Mrs. Hale. Jacob led her down a short hallway to a small bedroom. It was simple and clean, with a sturdy bed, a washstand, and an antique mirror that had a tiny crack in one corner. On the bedside table sat a ceramic oil lamp. "This was my sister's room when she stayed here," Jacob explained softly. "She's back east now with her own family, but we keep it ready for when she visits. I hope you'll be comfortable. There's fresh water in the pitcher and towels there." Elizabeth set her bonnet down on the bed. The weight of the day's events was catching up to her. She suddenly felt bone-tired. "It's more than I could have asked for. Thank you, Jacob," she said, meeting his eyes gratefully. He nodded and offered a gentle smile. "I'll let you get some rest. We usually start the day early on the ranch, but you take all the time you need in the morning. There's no rush for you to do anything, all right?" Elizabeth managed a small smile in return. "You've already done so much for me. I'll be sure to earn my keep." Jacob held up a hand in a friendly protest. "No need for that. But if you insist, we can talk in the morning. Sleep well, Miss Elizabeth." He backed out and gently closed the door, leaving her in quiet. Elizabeth sat down on the edge of the bed once she was alone. The room was lit by the soft orange glow of sunset filtering through the window. Her reflection in the mirror showed a young woman who looked as exhausted and uncertain as she felt. In the span of a single day, her life had swung from one path to another entirely. The thought of Henry's cruel rejection still stung sharply, but alongside that pain was a glimmer of gratitude for Jacob's unexpected kindness. She bowed her head and said a silent prayer, thanking God for guiding a good man like Jacob to her in her darkest hour. Then, with a heavy sigh, she prepared for bed, slipping out of her travel dress and into a simple cotton nightgown. For the first time in many nights, as Elizabeth settled under her mother's patchwork quilt, she felt a hint of safety and hope amid the sorrow. That night, she slept deeply, the lonely ache in her heart eased by the knowledge that at least tomorrow she would not have to face the world alone. Dawn came with a rosy glow and the cheerful crow of a rooster outside. Elizabeth awoke to unfamiliar sounds of ranch life, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the whinny of a horse, and the rhythmic thud of someone chopping wood. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, but as she sat up and looked around the modest guest room, the memory of the previous day rushed back. Her chest tightened at the thought of Henry's rejection, but she resolutely pushed the thought aside. She needed to be strong and figure out her future, and right now, that meant showing her gratitude to Jacob in whatever ways she could. She quickly dressed in a simple work frock from her trunk and carefully braided her dark hair. After splashing her face with cool water from the basin, she felt more awake. Determined to be useful, Elizabeth made her way quietly to the kitchen. The house was still except for muffled noises outside, likely Jacob or Roy already tending to the morning chores. In the kitchen, she found a cast-iron stove, a sack of flour, coffee beans, and some cured bacon. The pantry held a few jars of preserves and a basket with a couple of eggs. Elizabeth rolled up her sleeves. If she could prepare a hearty breakfast, it would be a proper thank you to her gracious host. Soon, the comforting smells of frying bacon and fresh coffee brewing wafted through the air. Elizabeth worked nimbly, mixing biscuit dough and stoking the stove's fire. She cracked the eggs into a pan to fry as well. Just as she was plating the food, the front door creaked open and Jacob stepped in, bringing a swirl of cool morning air with him. He paused, surprise lighting up his face as he inhaled the delicious scents and saw Elizabeth busy at the stove. "Good morning," she offered with a shy smile, wiping her hands on an apron she'd found hanging on a hook. "I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd make breakfast for everyone. It's the least I could do." Jacob removed his hat, a look of mild astonishment melting into appreciation. "Good morning, Elizabeth. That's very kind of you. You didn't have to, but it sure smells wonderful." He moved to the basin to wash up. Moments later, Roy entered as well, drawn by the aroma and looking pleased to see a hot meal waiting. The three of them sat around the small wooden table in the kitchen nook as the morning light streamed in. Jacob said a brief grace and then they all tucked in. Both Jacob and Roy complimented her cooking heartily. Roy even joked that he hadn't eaten this well since the last time Jacob's sister came to visit. Elizabeth felt a blush of pride warm her cheeks. It felt good to contribute, to be part of a household routine, even if just for the moment. Over the meal, Jacob gently steered the conversation by asking Elizabeth about her journey west. She answered openly, describing the train rides and stagecoach connections, the new sights of plains and mountains that had amazed her, and the anxious excitement she'd felt travelling into the unknown. She didn't yet speak of the heartbreak upon arrival. That wound was still too fresh to touch over breakfast. Instead, Elizabeth turned the question back to Jacob, asking about life on the ranch. Jacob explained that Sagebrush Hills Ranch had been in his family for decades. His father had established it when Jacob was a boy, and Jacob had taken over in his early 20s after his parents passed on. He ran cattle mostly, he said, with a few horses that he bred and trained. They had a couple of ranch hands like Roy to help with the workload. As he spoke, Elizabeth noticed a subtle change in Jacob's tone when he mentioned that it was just him now on the ranch. She wondered if her suspicions were true. Had he lost a wife before? She did not pry at that moment, but Jacob himself seemed to sense the unasked question lingering in the air. "It can be a lonely place sometimes," he admitted, looking down at his coffee. I was married once. My wife, Catherine, passed away nearly 2 years ago." His voice grew softer, touched with sadness. "Since then, it's just been me out here. My sister comes to visit when she can, but she has her own life back east." Elizabeth reached out instinctively and gently laid her hand on Jacob's forearm in sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. Jacob gave her a grateful nod, covering her hand briefly with his own calloused one for just a moment. "Catherine was a wonderful woman," he said quietly, "kind and spirited. She took ill, and despite my efforts and the doctors, He trailed off, the weight of the memory silencing him. Elizabeth felt his pain as if it were a physical presence in the room. Roy respectfully busied himself with his plate, as if giving them a symbol of privacy in the small kitchen. Elizabeth's heart ached for Jacob. She knew the sting of losing loved ones too. Her parents had died when she was young. In that moment, Elizabeth and Jacob shared a look of mutual understanding. Both had come to this frontier carrying sorrow in their hearts. Yet here they were, breaking bread together and finding small comfort in each other's company. Elizabeth realized that she felt more at ease with Jacob than she had with anyone in a very long time, perhaps since her parents were alive. A tentative friendship forged out of hardship and compassion was beginning to take root between them. After breakfast, Elizabeth insisted on washing up the dishes despite Jacob's protests that she was a guest. Once the kitchen was tidy, she offered to help with the ranch chores. Jacob smiled, clearly appreciative but a bit hesitant to task her with any hard labor. "Are you sure? You've done plenty already this morning," he said. Elizabeth nodded, determined. "I'm sure. I've never worked on a ranch before, but I'm not afraid of hard work. I want to contribute if I'm going to stay here for a time." Jacob relented and gave her a manageable task, tending the small vegetable garden behind the house and feeding the chickens that scratched around the yard. It was work Catherine used to do, he mentioned softly. Elizabeth took to the chores with enthusiasm. By mid-morning, she had collected a basket of eggs and pulled a few weeds from the neat rows of vegetables, while clucking hens pecked contentedly at the feed she scattered. As days passed, those small tasks grew into a routine. Elizabeth proved herself hard-working and eager to learn. In the mornings, she rose early to gather eggs and water the garden. Later, she would help Roy mend worn shirts or cook the midday meal for the ranch crew. Sometimes she carried cool drinks out to Jacob and the hands as they labored under the high sun, repairing fences or moving cattle. Each evening, she and Jacob would sit on the porch as the sky faded to violet, talking in low, easy tones about their day, or sometimes sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. A quiet companionship blossomed between them like a wildflower finding root in fertile soil. One soft twilight, Jacob showed Elizabeth the gravesite of his late wife, Catherine. It lay under a solitary oak tree on a gentle hill just beyond the house. The marker was simple, just Catherine's name and dates carved into wood, and wild prairie roses grew around the base. Jacob stood beside Elizabeth, hat in hand, and spoke in a tender voice about the woman he had loved and lost. He told her how Catherine had a love for reading and how she would play the old piano that still sat in the parlour, filling the house with music. He chuckled softly as he recounted how she had a sharp wit that could catch him off guard, even though she had a sweet and gentle demeanour. Elizabeth listened intently, her eyes on the little cross carved into the wooden marker as the breeze whispered through the grass. When Jacob fell quiet, Elizabeth placed a hand on his arm as she had done before. "She sounds like she was a wonderful person," Elizabeth said softly. "Thank you for telling me about her." Jacob nodded, eyes shining with memories. "She was. I miss her every day." He let out a slow breath. "I didn't think I would ever talk about her in the past tense with someone else. But with you, it feels all right." Elizabeth felt a warmth at his words, honoured by the trust he was placing in her. She understood he wasn't over his grief, perhaps one never truly is, but that he was letting her see a part of his heart that had long been buried in sorrow. It brought them closer, and she felt a delicate thread of affection weaving between her soul and his. Likewise, Elizabeth gradually opened up about her own life. One evening, as they sat shelling peas for supper, Jacob gently asked about her decision to become a mail-order bride. Elizabeth took a moment, turning a pea pod between her fingers as she collected her thoughts. She spoke of how, after her parents died, she had been raised in an orphanage until she was 16, how she had then laboured in a textile factory and later as a seamstress, always scraping by and often feeling terribly alone. She confessed her longing for a family of her own and a place to belong. Answering an advertisement to be a mail-order bride had been a leap of faith, a chance at stability and maybe even love, with a man who wanted a wife as badly as she wanted a home. She described the hopeful letters she and Henry exchanged and how she had truly believed in every word. Admitting how it had all ended, with her left alone on the station platform, brought a lump to her throat, and she fell silent, blinking back the tears that threatened. Jacob's voice was low and filled with empathy when he finally responded. "You took a brave step," he said. "It takes a strong soul to leave everything behind and venture into the unknown for the sake of hope." He shook his head slightly, a look of admiration on his face. "Henry's loss, and anyone else's who couldn't see your worth, will be someone else's gain." Elizabeth's heart gave a tiny flutter at those words, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. She dared not read too deeply into his remark, but in Jacob's gentle eyes she sensed a meaning that went beyond mere comfort. She offered a demure smile, breaking eye contact as she focused on shelling another pea. Still, she realized that her once shattered hope was quietly rebuilding itself, day by day, in the warmth of Jacob's presence. Summer stretched on, with Elizabeth staying at the ranch longer than she had ever anticipated. What began as a refuge for a single night became a week, then two, and then the weeks turned into the richness of an entire season. Jacob insisted she was welcome for as long as she needed to figure out her next steps. In truth, he had grown accustomed to her being there. He would catch himself smiling at the small, everyday things she did, like humming a lullaby tune while she hung laundry, or the way she scrunched her nose when concentrating on kneading bread. For Elizabeth, the ranch had started to feel like the home she'd always yearned for. She loved the land's vast, quiet beauty, the satisfaction of honest work, and most of all the company of the kind man who had saved her from despair. Yet for all the growing affection between them, neither Elizabeth nor Jacob had openly acknowledged the deeper feelings taking root in their hearts. Jacob, ever respectful, and perhaps still a bit cautious with his heart, treated Elizabeth with the courteous warmth of a dear friend. There were moments, like when their hands accidentally touched while reaching for the same tool, or when they shared a laugh that went on a tad too long, that hinted at something more, but both were a little uncertain and shy. Elizabeth sometimes wondered if she truly could stay forever, or if one day Jacob might feel obliged to help her move on, as originally planned. After all, he had offered shelter, not a permanent arrangement. And Jacob often wondered if Elizabeth still wished for the kind of life she'd sought in her letters, perhaps with a different man in town, and if she regretted not returning east. He didn't want to presume too much or risk a cherished friendship by voicing his own growing love. Fate, however, was about to push them out of their quiet hesitation. One scorching afternoon when August was at its driest, an eerie stillness hung in the air. Elizabeth was on the porch mending one of Jacob's work shirts when she noticed an odd orange tint to the sunlight. The faint scent of smoke reached her nose. Her mending forgotten, she stood, heart beginning to thump, and looked toward the southern horizon. A smudge of dark smoke was visible, curling upward and spreading out against the clear sky. At that moment, Jacob came galloping up the dirt road from the pasture, urgency in every line of his body. He reined in his horse sharply and called out even before the dust settled. "Elizabeth!" Elizabeth hurried down the steps, the hair on her arms rising in alarm. "What is it?" she asked, though the dread in her stomach already knew the answer. "There's a fire on the prairie spreading fast," Jacob said, voice taut but controlled. "Roy's already riding to warn the neighbouring farms. We have to prepare in case it turns toward us." Elizabeth felt a jolt of adrenaline. Prairie fire. The very words were enough to send fear through any homesteader's heart. Weeks of summer sun had turned the surrounding grasslands into tinder. One spark could set the world aflame, racing across the plains faster than a horse could gallop. She glanced back at the house, mind spinning with what needed to be done. Together, Jacob and Elizabeth sprang into action. Elizabeth ran to the rain barrel by the porch and began filling every bucket she could find with water, her arms trembling from the effort but fueled by determination. She lugged bucket after bucket to the side of the house, dousing the wooden walls and especially the roof shingles, trying to soak everything before embers could fall on it. Jacob dashed to the barn, returning with 2 shovels. He thrust one into Elizabeth's hands. "I'm going to start a firebreak trench on the south side," he shouted over the rising din of the wind. "If the flames reach this far, maybe a line of bare earth will slow them down." Elizabeth nodded, already following him. They dug furiously at the edge of the homestead's boundary, scraping and flinging aside dry grass and topsoil to expose the damp earth beneath, creating a makeshift barrier. The wind was picking up, hot and bitter with smoke, lashing their faces and carrying ash and debris. By the time Roy returned, sweat streamed down Jacob's face, and Elizabeth's skirt was soaked and muddied from her work with the buckets. Roy brought another ranch hand from a neighbouring spread, and both men leapt into action. They quickly herded the most valuable livestock, Jacob's prized horses and a small herd of milk cows, out to a wide pasture that had been recently grazed almost bare. With little grass left there to burn, it might serve as a refuge for the animals if the fire swept through. Elizabeth helped by opening gates and tossing a last bucket of water onto the chicken coop, her heart pounding wildly. Within an hour of that first wisp of smoke, the southern sky turned hazy and amber. The wildfire was closer now. Elizabeth could see a distant orange glow flickering on the horizon like a second sunset, and above it loomed a towering cloud of black smoke. The fire front was still perhaps a mile or 2 off, but unpredictable gusts were driving it toward the ranch. Embers began to rain down like hellish snowflakes. Jacob shoved a damp kerchief into Elizabeth's hands as she coughed on the thickening smoke. "Tie this over your nose and mouth," he instructed. She did so, eyes watering as heat and smoke intensified around them. The roar of the approaching inferno grew louder, a sound like a fast-approaching freight train mixed with the crackling of a giant campfire. Then, with terrifying speed, a tongue of flame raced through a patch of dry brush beyond the property line and leapt onto the ranch's south fence. The wooden posts went up like torches. Elizabeth saw the barn's haystack catch an ember and begin to smoulder. The fire was encircling them. "Jacob!" Elizabeth cried, pointing in horror as flames licked along the fence toward the barn. Jacob swore under his breath. He sprinted to the wagon hitched near the barn and began yoking the last horse to it, intending to use it as an escape if necessary. Over the roar, he shouted to Elizabeth, "Get whatever you can't bear to lose from the house, now!" Elizabeth's mind raced. The house. Inside it was everything she had left of her old life, and everything precious to Jacob too. She thought of her trunk with her few belongings, her mother's quilt, and the letters that were her only keepsakes of her past. She also knew Jacob had precious things in the house, the only photographs of his family, and Catherine's piano and portrait. She didn't waste another second. Holding her apron over her face against the smoke, Elizabeth sprinted through the front door of the house. Inside, the air was still breathable, but the smell of smoke was seeping in. The room was dimming as ash began to block out the sun. Elizabeth raced to her bedroom and dragged out her trunk with all her might. She pushed and pulled it down the hall and out onto the porch, coughing at the tendrils of smoke. Setting it by the door, she dashed back in. In the parlour, she snatched Jacob's family portrait from the wall, a precious image of his late parents. She also grabbed the framed sketch of Catherine that rested on the mantel. These, she knew, were irreplaceable treasures to him. As Elizabeth turned to leave, a sudden crash made her jump. One of the front windows shattered from the heat, spraying glass across the floor. Startled, Elizabeth stumbled on the corner of the braided rug and fell hard against the old rocking chair. Pain jolted through her ankle. She gasped and tried to stand, but her right ankle gave way, sharp agony lancing up her leg. She had twisted it badly. Outside, the flames had found a patch of the house's exterior that wasn't soaked through, and the porch roof was now beginning to catch fire. Thick smoke poured through the broken window and open door. Elizabeth's eyes burned and she clutched the precious framed items to her chest, panic rising. She struggled to limp forward, but each step on her injured ankle was torture. "Elizabeth!" The voice cut through the roar and crackle. Jacob appeared suddenly through the doorway like an apparition, silhouetted by firelight. Relief and fear washed over Elizabeth in equal measure. She cried out, "Jacob, my ankle!" She couldn't get the words out, but he saw her predicament at once. Without hesitation, Jacob bounded across the smoke-filled room. He pulled off his bandana and quickly wrapped it around Elizabeth's nose and mouth. Then he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Elizabeth, still clutching the framed photo and sketch, threw one arm around his neck. She buried her face against his shoulder as he carried her out the door. Outside, the heat was like a blast from a furnace. The front corner of the house was now aflame. Jacob carried Elizabeth down the porch steps just as part of the roof collapsed with a shower of sparks. He set her carefully on the ground near the waiting wagon and her trunk, coughing hard. His eyes were red from smoke, and sweat and soot streaked his face. Roy and the other hand were shouting from the pasture, signaling that the fire was sweeping around them. They had done all they could. Now survival was the only goal. Jacob saw that the barn was lost. Its thatched roof had ignited into a ball of fire. If they didn't flee now, they would be trapped. He quickly hoisted Elizabeth's trunk into the wagon and helped Elizabeth onto the wagon seat. She winced as she tried to maneuver her injured foot. Without a word, Jacob climbed up beside her, grabbing the reins with one hand while his other arm wrapped protectively around her waist to steady her. "Hang on," he yelled. He snapped the reins and the horse bolted forward, the wagon lurching into motion. They raced away from the burning homestead, following the route the livestock and men had taken toward the stream. Behind them, the inferno roared. Elizabeth glanced back in shock. The ranch she had come to love was a silhouette against a wall of orange flame and billowing smoke. Embers whipped past them in the wind. The horse whinnied in terror as flaming debris blew across their path. Jacob's jaw was set with fierce concentration. At one point, a burning tumbleweed tumbled directly in front of the wagon. Jacob veered sharply to avoid it. The wagon wheels skidded, and Elizabeth grabbed the seat rail tightly, her heart hammering. The wagon nearly tipped in the sudden turn, but Jacob's expert handling kept them upright. They thundered over the dry grassland, the choking smoke gradually thinning as they put precious distance between themselves and the fire. At last, they reached the shallow creek that Jacob had been aiming for, a natural barrier of water that the fire could not easily cross. The horse splashed through, and Jacob drove the wagon up onto a low rise of ground on the opposite bank, where dozens of cattle milled about, having instinctively fled there. The area had been burned by a smaller brush fire earlier in the summer, leaving nothing left to burn now, a life-saving safe zone of blackened earth. Roy and the other ranch hand were there too, waving Jacob and Elizabeth over frantically. Jacob pulled the wagon to a halt. For a few moments, neither he nor Elizabeth spoke. They were safe, but the reality of what had just happened, and what might still happen, sank in. From this vantage point, they could see the fire raging across Sagebrush Hills Ranch. Flames consumed the pastures and fences, and they licked hungrily at the house and barn. The sky above the ranch was black with smoke, and even at a distance the heat distorted the air in quivering waves. Elizabeth suddenly noticed that Jacob was slumped beside her, still holding the reins in a limp grasp. "Jacob!" she exclaimed, turning to him. Only then did she see the angry red burn on his left forearm and a bleeding gash on his cheek, likely from flying embers or debris. His shirt sleeve was singed. Jacob's eyes were fixed on the scene of destruction, his face a mask of grief and shock. Gently, Elizabeth reached over and touched his arm. "Jacob, you're hurt," she said, her voice tender but urgent. He blinked as if coming out of a trance. "It's all right," he rasped, but a wince escaped as he tried to move his injured arm. Elizabeth swiftly tore a strip from her petticoat and soaked it with water from the creek. With gentle care, she wrapped the cool, wet cloth around the burn on Jacob's arm, trying to soothe the blistering skin. Jacob allowed it silently, his eyes closing for a moment at the relief. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she then took her kerchief, already damp with either water or tears, she wasn't sure, and dabbed at the blood on his cheek. Jacob opened his eyes and looked at her. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The roar of the fire and the bawling of cattle faded into the background. Elizabeth's face was streaked with soot, her hair falling out of its braid, and her eyes were shining with concern and something deeper. "You came back for me," she whispered, her voice full of wonder and gratitude. In the chaos of fleeing, it was only now sinking in that Jacob had run into a burning house at the risk of his own life, just to find her. "Of course I did," Jacob replied hoarsely, as if the very idea of doing otherwise was unthinkable. He managed a shadow of a reassuring smile. "I'd do it again 1,000 times." In those simple words, carried on a ragged breath, lay a depth of feeling that neither of them had yet spoken aloud. Overcome, Elizabeth felt tears slip down her smoke-stained cheeks, tears of relief, fear, and overwhelming gratitude. Her heart swelled with an emotion she now recognized clearly as love. Unable to find the words to respond, she instead reached up and squeezed Jacob's hand that rested on his knee. He squeezed back, and then carefully drew her into a gentle embrace. They held onto each other as the fire slowly burned itself out in the distance, both shaken by how close they had come to losing everything, especially each other. Night fell, and the prairie was eerily quiet aside from the crackle of dying flames and the occasional lowing of distressed cattle. The once familiar landscape was now alien, a charred expanse under the smoky twilight. Jacob, Elizabeth, Roy, and the other hand set up a makeshift camp by the creek for the night. A few rescued blankets and supplies had been piled into the wagon, including Elizabeth's trunk and the keepsakes she saved. Roy managed to start a small campfire for light and warmth, using dry driftwood from the creek bed. They shared a little bit of food, some jerky and hardtack, though no one had much appetite. Exhaustion and shock made every movement slow. Elizabeth sat close to Jacob on a blanket that had been laid out on the ground. He had insisted she keep her injured foot elevated on the trunk. Now that adrenaline had ebbed, her ankle throbbed painfully and had swollen. Jacob had fashioned a crude splint for it from 2 slats of wood and strips of cloth. As she rested against Jacob's side, Elizabeth felt the steady rise and fall of his chest. He had his arm around her, holding her close against the chill that crept into the air. She could feel the slight tremble that still ran through him, the after-effects of fear and loss. Yet, in that darkness, they also found solace in each other's presence. Jacob pulled the blanket around Elizabeth's shoulders and softly murmured, "Are you warm enough?" She nodded and leaned her head against him. In the dim firelight, Jacob looked down at the young woman nestled against him and felt a surge of protectiveness and care. The terror of the day's events had laid bare the truth in his heart. He loved Elizabeth. He loved her kindness, her courage, and the light she had brought back into his life. Holding her now, he silently vowed never to let her face danger or sorrow alone again. Elizabeth, for her part, closed her eyes for a moment and simply breathed him in, the scent of smoke and sweat, and beneath that, something, essentially Jacob. In the curve of his arm, she felt safe despite the devastation around them. She realized that somewhere between the heartbreak that had brought her to this place and the flames they had weathered together, she had fallen deeply in love with Jacob Hale. The magnitude of that realization might have frightened her under different circumstances, but right now it felt as natural as breathing. Neither of them voiced these feelings on that long, somber night, but in the gentle way they clung to each other, their hearts spoke volumes. By first light, the fire had largely burned itself out. A merciful rain shower rolled in during the pre-dawn hours, a gentle rain that dampened the lingering embers and laid the dust. When the morning sun finally rose, it illuminated a landscape utterly changed. The rolling pastures of Sagebrush Hills Ranch were now swathes of black and grey. Thin columns of smoke still rose from a few smouldering stumps. The ranch buildings were in ruins. The barn had collapsed into a smoking heap of charred timbers. One of the storage sheds was gone entirely. The main house stood partially, its south and west walls blackened, and the roof half missing where the fire had eaten through. Jacob, Elizabeth, and the others walked back across the creek as soon as it was safe, their boots squelching in the damp ash. Elizabeth leaned on Jacob, hobbling on her splinted ankle. She gasped softly at the sight of the destruction. The place that had been so full of life and warmth just a day before was now scarred and silent. Jacob's face was drawn, but he set to work immediately, driven by determination. He organized everyone to check for any remaining hotspots and to assess what could be saved. Elizabeth insisted on helping despite Jacob's protests that she should rest. She refused to sit idle and instead busied herself with what she could do. She limped through the charred wreckage of the house, grateful to find that not all was lost. The part of the house that they had soaked most heavily was singed, but still intact. In the kitchen, the cast-iron stove stood solid, and the pantry cupboard, though smoky, had survived. The parlour was badly damaged. Catherine's piano was a ruin of cracked wood and warped strings, which made Elizabeth's heart ache for Jacob's sake. But the mantel where Catherine's sketch had been was still there, empty, but there. Thank God she had saved that sketch and the Hales family photo. Neighbours who had been alerted by Roy began arriving by midday to help. Some came on horseback, others by wagon, bringing tools, spare lumber, and food. The Frontier Code of Community meant that everyone pitched in when disaster struck. They helped extinguish the last embers and started the overwhelming cleanup and initial repairs. One neighbour offered to take in the remaining cattle temporarily. Another brought a tent for Jacob and Elizabeth to use as shelter until the house could be made livable again. Throughout it all, Jacob remained stoic and focused, thanking everyone sincerely for their help. By evening, with the immediate crisis behind them, Jacob finally allowed himself to pause. One of the neighbours had brought over a hot stew and insisted that Jacob and Elizabeth sit and eat. The two of them found a relatively clean spot on the front step of the house, which was still sturdy, and shared the meal from tin bowls. The rain had cooled the air, and it was strangely peaceful now, the terrible excitement replaced by an exhausted calm. Most of the neighbours had gone home, promising to return the next day to continue helping. Roy was staying, bunking in the barn's lean-to that had miraculously escaped total destruction. Elizabeth finished what little she could eat of the stew and set the bowl aside. Her body was weary, and her ankle throbbed, but she felt even more strongly the ache coming from Jacob's heart as he surveyed the remnants of his life's work. She reached over and took his hand gently. "We'll rebuild," she said softly. "Your home. It can be built again." Jacob looked at their joined hands, then at Elizabeth. Soot still streaked her face, and her hair was messy and wind-blown, but to him, she had never looked more beautiful. She was alive, and here beside him, that was what mattered most. He gave her hand a squeeze. "Yes, we will," he replied quietly. There was steel in his voice, but when he turned fully to her, his expression softened. He He carefully brushed a smudge of ash from her cheek with his thumb. But first, we need to take care of you. That ankle should be properly wrapped. He insisted on rebandaging her ankle with fresh cloth and a bit of salve a neighbour had left. Elizabeth allowed it, touched by his attentiveness. He knelt in front of her to wind the bandage snugly but gently around her swollen ankle. When he was done, Jacob looked up at her. They were alone now on the porch step, the burnt ruins around them silent witnesses. Dusk was falling, and the first stars were appearing in the purple sky. That should do for now, Jacob said softly. Try to stay off it for a few days at least. He started to rise, but Elizabeth held onto his hand, her grip surprisingly firm for someone so tired. Jacob, she began, her voice trembling slightly. She wasn't entirely sure what she wanted to say first. There were so many emotions welling up inside her. But as he stayed there on one knee, concern and affection mingling in his gaze, the words came. I have no words to thank you for what you did. For everything. Her eyes filled anew with tears. You saved my life. Jacob immediately shook his head. I only did what anyone with a heart would do, he said. But Elizabeth squeezed his hand, pressing on. Please let me finish. She took a steadying breath. You risked yourself without a second thought to come for me in that fire. You've been nothing but generous and good to me since the moment we met. In my darkest hour, you gave me kindness. You gave me a home and hope when I had none. And during the fire, I realized something. Her voice caught, and a tear escaped, rolling down her cheek. Losing this house. Losing the ranch. It would have been terribly sad. But losing you, her voice broke on a soft sob. Losing you would have been unbearable. Jacob's eyes shone in the dim light as he lifted his free hand to gently wipe away her tear. Elizabeth, he whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. In that single word, her name, there was a world of feeling. He cupped her cheek in his palm. You won't ever lose me. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere. Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning into his warm, work-roughened hand. A faint smile curved her lips as more tears fell. This time, tears of happiness breaking through the sorrow. Jacob drew a shaky breath and continued, his heart on his sleeve. The day I saw you at the station, I just wanted to help. I never imagined that a stranger would so quickly become the most important person in my life. He gave a soft, incredulous laugh at the wonder of it. These weeks with you, Elizabeth, they've brought me a joy I thought I'd never feel again after Catherine passed. I was afraid to speak of it, afraid it might be too soon, or that you'd leave one day and I'd be alone again. But when I ran into that burning house and saw you there on the floor, I knew I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. He gently tilted her face so she looked into his eyes. I love you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth felt her heart soar at hearing those words, the very words she had quietly longed to hear. A radiant smile broke across her face, and she let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob of joy. Oh, Jacob, I love you too, she confessed. Saying it out loud felt like the sun bursting through the clouds. Her hands went to either side of his face, tracing the soot-streaked plains gently. I love you, she repeated softly, as if to assure them both that this was real. Relief and happiness flooded Jacob's features. He covered one of her hands with his own, turning his head to place a tender kiss on her palm. For a moment, they simply stayed like that, smiling at each other through tears, both a little in awe of the moment. Despite the ashes and ruin around them, or perhaps more so because of it, this declaration of love felt all the more profound. They had literally walked through fire together and come out the other side bound to one another. After a beat, Jacob cleared his throat lightly and reached into the pocket of his trousers. I was going to wait for a more perfect time than this, he said, a hint of nervous humour in his tone, but now seems as perfect a time as any. He drew out a small object and held it in his palm. It glinted faintly in the twilight. Elizabeth recognized it at once and caught her breath. It was a simple gold wedding band, a bit dented and scratched from years of wear, but lovingly kept. It had been Catherine's ring. Jacob had shown it to Elizabeth once when he was reminiscing about his late wife, explaining it was a family heirloom. Jacob's fingers closed around the ring for a moment as he found his words. This belonged to my grandmother, and then to my wife, he said quietly. Before Catherine, he paused, then continued, voice steady. Before she passed, she made me promise something. She told me to not let sorrow trap my heart forever. She said I should find happiness again and give this ring to the woman who could make me smile the way I used to. He managed a small, warm smile as he looked at Elizabeth. It's taken some time, but I believe I've found that woman. Elizabeth's eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth. Tears brimmed once more as she realized what he was saying. Jacob took her left hand in his, holding the ring poised near her finger. Elizabeth, you are the bravest, kindest soul I know. You brought light and laughter back into my home and into my heart. You are my blessing that came from the ashes. He took a breath, and his hazel eyes met hers with unwavering sincerity. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? A joyful cry escaped Elizabeth's lips. Yes, yes, of course I will marry you, Jacob, she exclaimed, her voice shaking with happiness. Tears of joy spilled down her cheeks freely now. Jacob's face broke into a grin so full of pure delight that it chased away the last shadows of grief lingering there. His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the gold band onto Elizabeth's finger. It was a touch loose, but neither of them paid that any mind. It shone in the faint light, a symbol of promises kept and new beginnings. Elizabeth threw her arms around Jacob's neck and he rose to his feet, lifting her up with him as she did. He held her close and they shared a sweet, lingering kiss beneath the quiet sky, sealing their pledge of love and devotion. In that embrace, all the heartbreak and hardship that had led them to this point seemed to fall away. What remained was hope. Hope and the bright certainty that they would face whatever the future held together. News of Jacob Hale's engagement to Elizabeth spread quickly through the small frontier community. Given the recent fire and the dramatic circumstances that attested them, the story of how Jacob and Elizabeth found love stirred the hearts of their neighbors. Visitors came by the half-burned ranch in the following days, not only to lend tools and helping hands, but also to offer congratulations and warm wishes. It seemed everyone was genuinely thrilled that Jacob had found love again, and that Elizabeth had found the home and family she deserved. Even in a time of loss, there was a feeling of celebration in the air. In the weeks that followed, the ranch steadily rose from its ashes. The barn was rebuilt beam by Jacob, Roy, and several neighboring ranchers. Fences were repaired, and the charred fields began showing stripes of green as new grass courageously poked through the blackened soil. Elizabeth's ankle healed enough that she could walk without the splint, and she insisted on helping with lighter tasks, repainting furniture that had been smoke-damaged, sewing new curtains to replace those lost, and preparing hearty meals for the work crews each day. The main house's interior was scrubbed clean of soot and smoke and partially re-roofed. Through all the hustle of rebuilding, Jacob and Elizabeth's impending wedding was a beacon of joy that everyone looked forward to. They decided on a simple ceremony to be held right at the ranch. There was no church for miles, and in any case, both bride and groom felt it was fitting to exchange vows on the very land where they had persevered and fallen in love. A traveling preacher from the next town agreed to come on the chosen date, both to officiate the wedding and to check on the fire-stricken community's recovery. By the time autumn painted the prairie in strokes of gold and purple, Jacob and Elizabeth's wedding day arrived. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue that morning, the air crisp and carrying a hint of the coming winter. Nature seemed to have decorated for the occasion. Late-blooming wildflowers, goldenrod and asters, dotted the edges of the fields, and the oak tree on the hill bore a crown of autumn leaves. Under that very oak, the one that shaded Catherine's resting place, the ceremony was to be held. It was Jacob's idea to have it there, a way to include Catherine's memory as a peaceful, approving presence. Some might have found it melancholy, but to Jacob it felt right, and Elizabeth wholeheartedly agreed. Friends and neighbors gathered and helped transform the area under the oak into a wedding setting. They built a simple arch from young willow branches and draped it with ribbons of ivory and sage green that one of the neighbor ladies had sewn from spare fabric. Mason jars filled with wild daisies and bunches of purple asters hung from the lower branches of the oak, gently swinging in the breeze. Rough-hewn wooden benches were laid out in 2 rows for guests, with extra hay bales covered in quilts as overflow seating. By late afternoon, everything was ready. Inside the house, which, thanks to many hands, was mostly restored and welcoming again, Elizabeth prepared for the ceremony. She wore a lovely borrowed wedding gown. A neighbor's daughter had worn it a few years before, and they had carefully altered it to fit Elizabeth's slender frame. The dress was cream-colored linen with lace trimming the sleeves and neckline, modest, yet beautiful. Someone had even helped mend and refashion Elizabeth's mother's quilt into a shawl for the evening chill, although she didn't wear it for the ceremony. Elizabeth's dark hair was brushed until it shone, and then loosely pinned up, with a few soft curls framing her face. At the last moment, the neighbor who'd lent the dress tucked little sprigs of baby's breath flowers into Elizabeth's hair as a finishing touch. When Elizabeth looked at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman there. She looked happy, even radiant. It wasn't the fancy silk and satin bridal ensemble she once might have envisioned in girlish dreams, but it was perfect. This dress and the loving hands that had readied it carried far more meaning. Jacob, meanwhile, waited outside under the oak, clad in his Sunday best suit, the very same he'd worn on his wedding day with Catherine, dusted off and aired out. Despite their best efforts, a faint scent of smoke still clung to the fabric, but Jacob joked that it added character. He stood tall, freshly shaven and hair neatly trimmed, with a new sense of peace and anticipation about him. On his chest he wore a simple boutonniere Elizabeth had made, a single white daisy and a sprig of sagebrush tied with twine. Roy, acting as something between a best man and a proud father figure, fussed over Jacob's collar and made sure his bow tie was straight. Jacob endured it with good-natured patience, his eyes frequently straying toward the house, eager for the first glimpse of his bride. At last, the time came. The small crowd of about 20 guests took their seats, murmurs of excitement rippling among them. Roy escorted Elizabeth from the house to the start of the makeshift Isle of Petals that children had scattered. When Jacob saw Elizabeth emerge, he felt his breath catch in his throat. She was ethereal in the afternoon light, moving with grace despite the slight limp that still lingered from her healing ankle. The gentle breeze picked up the hem of her dress and fluttered the ribbons in her hair. To Jacob, she looked like a dream made real. Elizabeth's heart pounded with a mixture of nerves and bliss as she began to walk down the petal-strewn path between the benches. Her gaze locked onto Jacob's almost immediately, and everything else fell away. The guests, the decorations, the world. She saw the tears of joy glistening in Jacob's eyes and the loving smile that spread across his face, and any last remnants of anxiety she had melted. She was going to marry the man she loved with all her heart, a man who cherished her for exactly who she was. It was more than she had ever dared hope for. Jacob couldn't wait a moment longer. In a spontaneous move that drew fond chuckles from the onlookers, he stepped forward and met Elizabeth halfway down the aisle. He offered his arm to her, and she gratefully took it. They shared a little laugh together, eyes shining. Then, arm in arm, they proceeded toward the arch under the oak tree. Among the guests, there was one unexpected attendee standing quietly at the very back. Henry, the very man who had abandoned Elizabeth, had arrived unnoticed by most. Word of Elizabeth's near tragedy and subsequent engagement had reached him in town. Overwhelmed by guilt and perhaps curiosity, he had come, though not as a celebrant. He kept to the shadow of a far-off oak, hat in hand and head bowed. As Elizabeth passed by with Jacob, Henry watched with regret heavy in his chest. He realized fully now that in casting Elizabeth aside, he had lost a treasure. But Elizabeth noticed him only fleetingly. She met his eyes for the briefest moment, and Henry gave a subtle nod, whether of apology or acknowledgement she wasn't sure. Then her attention was drawn back to Jacob, as it should be. Any vindication or lingering hurt she might have felt was washed away by the greater tide of joy within her. Henry's presence didn't matter. He was a closed chapter. She had long since forgiven him in her heart, because if not for his rejection, she would never have found Jacob. Under the arch, Jacob and Elizabeth faced one another as the preacher, a kindly, weathered man who had ridden 15 miles that day, began the ceremony. The leaves of the oak rustled gently above, and the setting sun cast a golden glow over everything. The preacher spoke of love, commitment, and second chances. Elizabeth felt tears of happiness prickle as she listened, and then repeated the vows in a clear, steady voice. I, Elizabeth, take you, Jacob, to be my lawfully wedded husband. Her eyes never left Jacob's as she promised to love him for all of her days, in good times and bad, until death should part them. Jacob's deep voice was tender and resolute as he made his vows in turn. I, Jacob, take you, Elizabeth, to be my lawfully wedded wife. He vowed to cherish and protect her, to stand by her side through whatever life might bring. As he spoke, his thumb gently caressed the back of Elizabeth's hand, silently reassuring her that this moment was real and solid. When it came time to exchange rings, Jacob produced a second ring that had been tucked safely in Roy's pocket. It was a plain gold band that had belonged to Jacob's father, now polished and resized to fit Jacob's own finger. Elizabeth's ring, of course, was already on her hand, Catherine's heirloom band that Jacob had given her the night of the fire. It gleamed with new significance now. Jacob slipped it off just long enough for the preacher to bless the rings. Then, with hands that only shook a little, Jacob slid the cherished band back onto Elizabeth's finger, sealing his pledge. Elizabeth reciprocated, taking the ring meant for Jacob and placing it on his strong, work-roughened hand with a loving smile. The metal was cool against his skin, but the gesture warmed his heart immensely. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher announced joyfully. You may kiss the bride. Jacob needed no further prompting. He gently cupped Elizabeth's face between his hands and leaned down to kiss her. It was a soft, sweet kiss, yet filled with all the love and promise that had brought them to this day. The gathered guests burst into cheers and applause. A couple of Jacob's rancher friends let out celebratory whoops, and the children giggled at the sight of the kiss, which to them was both amusing and touching. Under that ancient oak where once sorrow was laid to rest, a new union full of hope was blessed. Elizabeth laughed softly through happy tears as Jacob pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, both of them a bit overwhelmed and exhilarated. Around them, the guests began lining up to offer hugs and congratulations. Even the preacher dabbed his eyes. Frontier weddings were often casual affairs, but something about this one had clearly moved him. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden rays over the prairie, the wedding party moved to the open space beside the house for a modest reception. Tables fashioned from planks and barrels held dishes that neighbors had contributed, roasted chicken, loaves of fresh bread, jars of pickled vegetables, berry pies, and a jug or two of hard cider. Someone had found a few strings of dried flowers and strung them up like garlands from the porch eaves. It was humble by big city standards, but to Jacob and Elizabeth, it was perfect. Laughter and lively conversation rose into the crisp evening air. A fiddler struck up a cheerful tune, "Oh, Susanna," and soon enough there was dancing. Jacob, with a playful grin, swept Elizabeth into his arms for their first dance as husband and wife. They moved in a slow circle at first, more swaying than dancing, gazing into each other's eyes, oblivious to everyone else. Then, encouraged by clapping onlookers, Jacob twirled her around, and Elizabeth's laughter rang out like music. The skirt of her dress flared and her boots shuffled in the dust to the quickening rhythm. Others joined in, spinning their own partners or clapping along in time. Roy raised a toast once the music paused, loudly proclaiming, "To Jacob and Elizabeth, may your love be as strong as a well-broke Mustang and as endless as the open range." Everyone echoed the toast with cheers. Glasses of cider and cups of lemonade clinked. Elizabeth blushed and smiled, holding Jacob's hand tightly as they acknowledged the crowd's warm wishes. In that moment, Elizabeth felt enveloped by a profound sense of belonging. She looked around at the faces, these people who were now her friends and neighbours. Just months ago, she had been utterly alone, thinking herself unwanted, and now she was surrounded by kindness and joy. She had a family here, not one of blood, but one built of compassion and shared experiences. And at the centre of it all was Jacob, who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Her heart overflowed with gratitude. As twilight settled, the guests gradually took their leave, some riding off in wagons with lanterns bobbing in the dark, others staying to help clean up. Henry had quietly slipped away immediately after the ceremony, unseen by most, taking his solitary regret with him. By the time the stars pricked the sky, only Jacob, Elizabeth, and Roy remained at the ranch, along with a couple of the closest neighbours who were tidying up serving dishes. Roy shook Jacob's hand vigorously and gave Elizabeth a fatherly hug. "You two take care now, you hear?" he said with a broad smile. "This place'll be good as new in no time, and it'll sure be nice to hear some lil ones' laughter around here soon." He winked, causing Elizabeth to flush pink and Jacob to chuckle deeply. With that bit of teasing, Roy departed to bunk in the newly raised barn, giving the newlyweds the privacy of the house. At last, Jacob and Elizabeth found themselves alone. The nearly full moon cast a gentle glow over the homestead. Despite the scars of the fire still visible here and there, peace had returned to the land and to their hearts. Inside the house, the parlour had been cleaned, and a new rug lay where the old one had burned. On a small table rested Elizabeth's trunk, brought in from the wagon, and now a fixture of what would be her new home. The scent of recently baked pie and wood smoke lingered pleasantly in the air. Jacob led Elizabeth to the porch, where two rocking chairs waited side by side. He had salvaged one from the fire and borrowed another, determined that they would end their wedding day relaxing under the stars. They settled into the chairs, still in their wedding finery, too happy and full of adrenaline to consider changing or sleeping just yet. Elizabeth rested her head on Jacob's shoulder as they gently rocked in unison. The vast night sky stretched above, glittering with countless stars. A soft breeze stirred the prairie grass, carrying the distant sound of a nightjar's call. She sighed in utter contentment. "I never imagined, when I came west, that I would find all this," she murmured. "It's more than I ever dreamed of." Jacob kissed the top of her head softly. "Neither did I," he replied. "Sometimes life gives us a rough start, so that we know how blessed we are when the good comes." He recalled the lonely, grief-stricken man he'd been at the start of the summer, and marvelled at how much had changed. Elizabeth nodded, feeling contentment settle deep in her very bones. The pains of the past, her orphaned childhood, and even the heartbreak with Henry had all led her along a path straight into Jacob's arms. Strange as it was, she realized she could even feel grateful for those hardships now, for they had brought her here. Jacob turned her gently to face him, his eyes shining with love. "Mrs. Hale," he addressed her with a smile, the new title sending a warm thrill through Elizabeth. "Welcome home." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled. "I'm home," she whispered happily, and leaned up to kiss him once more. In the shelter of each other's embrace, and under the blanket of endless western stars, Jacob and Elizabeth knew that their journey, from despair to hope, from strangers to soulmates, had been nothing short of miraculous. Together, they would write the rest of their days on this open land, side by side. And as the night breeze whispered through the grasses, it carried a single gentle promise, that love, born from embers and faith, would forever light their way in the wild and beautiful West.